Welcome back to Performers and to part 2 of Sum It Up by Pat Summitt. If you haven't yet listened to part 1, we recommend you go back and listen to that before continuing with us here. Or if you're only interested in listening to half of the story, welcome aboard. For those that have listened to part 1, welcome back, and let's jump right back in.
Better to have a few rules, but strictly enforce them. I treated them like adults until they gave me reason not to. And they usually didn't. As long as they abided by rules, I was pretty flexible. But if they didn't, I could be as tough as any person they'd ever met. I also prided myself on being firm, fair, and consistent. Greg, you can choose your actions, but you cannot choose the consequences.
Absolutely not. And I think this links back to where we kind of left things off last time, to that idea of providing autonomy, right? To allow people to develop their own rules and perhaps even their own consequences to those rules as well. If we're looking to develop ownership and we're looking to develop commitment, giving people a say on what is and what isn't permitted, and also maybe a little bit about what the consequences might be. It doesn't mean that you get to necessarily choose exactly how they're going to manifest. But if your behavior isn't lined up with those values and beliefs, could be trouble here.
The thing I tried to emphasize first and foremost was that we're all a family and that you take care of and protect your family. Each policy told our kids what we really cared about. The Lady Vols had a 100% graduation rate. Every kid who played for 4 years got her degree, and that didn't happen without rules and policies. Lady Vols were required to sit in the first 3 rows of every lecture so the professors knew that they were there. And no cuts, no unexcused absences were permitted. If you cut class, you didn't play in the next game, period. Now, Greg, I want to touch on this notion of family. I think that word is often used in team sports. Personally, I'm not sure that it fits in pro sports where there's a business focus. College sports, maybe, where there's young people and they're living away from home for the first time. There's maybe that forced connectedness and a college identity. I'm not sure about family is the right term. What are your thoughts? And I don't think it has a place necessarily in the workplace.
It's a really tough one to think about. I think it can be abused. That sounds like a really strong word, but I think it can be used to kind of coerce people into doing things, for the sake of the family or the greater good, as it were. I think that sometimes people wouldn't treat their family the way that they treat their teammates, right? But I think what that kind of, if we look at it in the nicest possible lens, what we're talking about for that family is you'd be willing to do anything for family, right? And if we go right back to Pat's early roots here, family was first, right? It was about the toil on the farm, the collective effort and energy to make sure that we had the means and the things that they needed in order to literally survive. So when I hear family here, and I have that context, I have that background of what family means, then I think it's a really, really good thing. I think it can go both ways. It can be something that can be used to coerce people into doing things that maybe we shouldn't be doing, but I think it can also be used for good as well.
I think we're talking about connectedness here, and she says, we cared about their reputations and appearance. We didn't have a dress code, but we didn't allow hats or tattoos or jeans when we traveled because the players were representatives of the university. We cared about being respectful. No one was allowed to get a technical foul except for the head coach. We didn't use foul language. I didn't even swear much in private because I wasn't allowed growing up. We made eye contact when we were spoken to, and we were polite whether we were dealing with a high dollar donor or a waitress or a housekeeper. When we stayed in hotels, I insisted they kept their rooms in decent shape. All of this added up to a tremendous sense of pride within our program. We all cared equally about the Lady Vols logo. So can you speak to that idea of having pride in a team or a business?
And if we pull a definition of what pride actually is here, the one that I found was a feeling that you respect yourself and deserve to be respected by other people. I think that it's, again, sort of the narrative that we not necessarily tell ourselves in this situation, but the narrative of the story that we tell other people about who we are, what we do, maybe who we represent and where we come from.
That's a really great point, and I think pride helps establish a culture. I did say, don't let me find out about your business. If it reaches me, that means you haven't kept it private. If I find out about your business, then I will be in your business. And I taught them how to run their own meetings without coaches. how to have a discussion and confront their issues in a constructive way rather than backbiting. You all need to figure this out for yourselves, I'd say. So again, even with the rules, she's setting that culture whereby you start to police yourself with regards to your behavior.
Yeah, there's as a coach, you've got this position of power where you can come in and assert authority over a certain situation. But I think what we're not starting to see here, but a continual theme here is that ability to empower people by essentially, as a coach, as an authority figure, surrendering a little bit of that power, surrendering a little bit of that control, knowing that done in a responsible and useful manner, that can be a really powerful tool for teams or groups to be able to conflict resolve, to be able to use confrontation in a positive way. Confrontation sometimes has a negative connotation to it, but I think anytime there is conflict, it needs to be confronted. And I think putting that power in the hands of, in this case, the players, and empowering them to sort of be the marshals and the stewards of their circumstances and their environment, I think that's a very brave thing to do as a coach, but I think a very in terms of long-term implications, a very, very good thing for a coach to do.
As a coach, as an educator, as a mentor, a fundamental lesson that we hear about a lot is related to feedback. And she says one of the lessons that she learned was that in the absence of feedback, people will fill in the blanks with a negative. They'll assume that you don't care about them or don't like them. With too much praise, you lose your effectiveness. But with too much criticism, also loses effectiveness. Eventually they will tune you out. So this idea, I think people fill in the blanks when they don't have enough information or they're not giving feedback. I think that just transcends performance domains. Do you want to touch on a little bit of that feedback mechanism?
I think when it comes to feedback, whether that's positive or whether it's negative, I've heard the analogy of sugar used. So stay with me here. Where if you have, let's say, a cup of tea, for example, if you have a cup of tea, some sugar in there is going to enhance that cup of tea. If you take sugar, but too much of it is going to actually spoil it, and it becomes ineffective and essentially undrinkable. So as a coach, and again, this is getting to understand who your athletes are, how they like to receive feedback, what kind of feedback it is that they like, where and when, and does it have to come from me? Can it come from them? All of these different nuances that we have touched upon in previous episodes, recognizing that feedback is this multifaceted tool, knowing, okay, well, how do with this group and with my traits as a leader, how do I effectively deliver feedback to make sure everyone has a clear and unambiguous message and an understanding of that message? That's something that takes practice, and that's something that takes deliberate effort.
And ultimately, you're not going to reach and you're not going to connect with everyone. And Pat says, our program was no paradise, and my methods weren't faultless. I don't want to give the impression that every kid I touched magically became an All-American with a degree. Tennessee wasn't for everyone, and everyone wasn't for Tennessee. There were some players who didn't consider me family, whom I either failed to reach or I mishandled. In 38 years, a total of 34 players either left the team or transferred. To be frank, some of those who stayed all 4 years weren't that enchanted with me either. But some didn't always get the caring part, only the yelling. Some felt used. Some didn't like a white lady with a southern accent barking at them. Each night at home, I would hold Tyler and chew my lip over whether I was being too harsh. So, certain high performance environments aren't for everyone, to keep it simple.
Ain't that the truth? You know, if it was easy, everyone would do it and everyone could thrive in a high performance environment. But we know that's not the case. And again, we go back to that idea of an examined life, right? Looking at these things and going, okay, if I'm in a high performance environment, is this right for me? Not only can you succeed from a objective output, outcome, KPI perspective, but also you're happy here, right? You're more than just the sum total of your work, whether that's high performance in sport or high performance in other performance domains. But recognizing that, yeah, it's hard and not everyone can handle it. And that is not a knock on anyone that doesn't perform particularly well in these high performance and really demanding environments, because it just doesn't fit everyone.
So we're going to actually jump to a little bit of basketball, Greg. And during this period, they had won their second national championship in 1989. And during their third national championship in 1991, they're playing Virginia. And here's some in-game coaching that I think we can dive into a little bit. And she says, We were still down by 2, and then Dina drew a foul with 3 seconds left. She went to the line for 2 free throws that could send it into overtime. Virginia called a timeout to ice her. The timeout lasts 60 seconds, and in that brief, hectic segment, you have to send a message to your players that they believe in and trust. I learned the first thing you say and the last thing you say will stick. Everything else goes in one ear and out the other. It was critical that the message they heard from me was positive. I had to instill confidence. She said, when Dina makes these 3 throws, I began, and gave our players some defensive instructions. Then right before the huddle broke, I repeated, when Dina makes these 3 throws. So Greg, words have great power, and Coach Summitt is so intentional here.
Intentional is a really, really nice word, and I think you're right. Being very deliberate, knowing that words have an impact, and knowing that the ability to shoot a free throw isn't what's at play here, right? It's the ability to shoot a free throw under pressure. So what happens under pressure? Well, we start to question ourselves. We've just talked about that negativity bias. Soon we start to suck in those into that vacuum. We suck in those doubts and those things, that the little voices in our head that maybe say we can't do it. What if I fail? Oh, you should make this shot. All of these different things that are starting to cascade in thoughts. And in a single sentence, what Coach Summitt's done here is distill the messaging down to 1, I believe in you. 2, you should believe in yourself. And 3, you've got the capability to do this, right? And going in there in that little subtle reminder, bookending it, right? First thing you say, last thing you say, consistent, simple message. What do we want to do? I believe in you. Go out and execute it. Man, that's got to feel good as an athlete.
Well, let's hear from an athlete. What was their feeling and their perspective in this moment? And it said, it was Tennessee's 3rd national championship in 5 years. But for me, it felt like a first. I'd never won one that felt so complete. There was a huge amount of trust that transpired in that last segment and then overtime. There was no look in Pat's eyes that showed any type of defeat. There was just a huge bond between us because the foundation had been laid. And that's Nikki Caldwell, one of the players. So they're looking to the coach for guidance in an extreme pressure environment, and they see no sign of defeat. We talk all the time about the importance of a coach behaving in the way they want their players to perform and act in certain pressure moments. Break it down.
So this is called modeling, right? Where essentially we are modeling the behavior that we want the people that are, let's say, following us or under our tutelage to exist. Now, I'm going to get on my soapbox here and say one of the things that I hate when I watch, and it's usually college sports, and it's usually American football, is an American football coach that can't control their emotions, that has to have another coach grab them by the back. And this coach has a name. Unfortunately, it's usually a strength coach, but it's the get back coach that keeps a hold of football coaches from going on the field so they don't get a penalty. Then what you see is a player maybe struggles, makes a mistake on the field, can't control themselves, can't control their emotions, and then they come off the field, and then the coach has a right go at them at the side of the field because they didn't control their emotions or their focus or whatever, despite having just had to be held back by a grown man because you couldn't control your ability to get on the pitch, right? Or to stay off the field. Right, that's my rant over. I hate that. That is modeling of entirely the wrong behaviors. What we're seeing here is this idea of modeling of, if I want my players to be cool, calm, and collective, what we'd consider to be composed, what does that look like? Can I give them a model that they can therefore align their behavior to? The greats are wonderful at modeling the things that they want to happen and instilling that in their athletes and empowering them to go out there and do exactly the same.
Couldn't have said it better. Fantastic breakdown, Greg. And post 1991, Coach Summitt has now won 3 national championships, and she's still dealing with 18 to 21-year-olds. And she says, knocking heads with stubborn young players was often a necessary part of their evolution. Sometimes it was the only way to convince self-concerned 18 to 21-year-olds to set aside their insecurities, their cares, motives, and agendas and buy into something as self-sacrificing as the Tennessee program. That idea of self-sacrifice, putting your ego aside and buying into something bigger, that is coaching, that is leadership right there.
18 to 21-year-olds, I mean, brains aren't even fully formed yet, right? And we're asking them to, hey, I want you to think big picture about representing this institution and something bigger than yourself. That's ice skating uphill at times, right? And sometimes you can only really see what's going on in your immediate locale. But asking them to do that and then saying, here's how we do that, and providing the guidance and sort of shepherding them along that path, yeah, that's really hard for coaches. And if you think it's easy getting into coaching, then I think you're going to be really not pleasantly surprised.
There are patterns, there are stages of development, and she says usually I could set my watch by their development. As freshmen and sophomores, they were resistant and defensive, unable to bear criticism. Then they grow up, and by their junior and senior years, they understood that we were in it together, and they got to like the sound of my voice. But not there were no two players that were alike. Some were very average adolescents with the usual sensitive feelings. Others had truly serious deficiencies. I was learning that with each one, you had to treat them different and they had different pressure points. And that was the interesting part of the job. So I think as with coaching and working with people, especially young athletes, there are developmental stages. There are consistencies that we can see in that developmental process. And there are a lot of differences between people. There's obviously physical maturity, emotional, intellectual, skill level. People will develop at different stages, but there are patterns we can see.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to this analogy that was used earlier on, the idea of picking the lock. When it comes to lock picking, which I know you've got an extensive background in, so I'm sorry for stealing your thunder. There's going to be general principles on how to pick that type of lock, whether it's a combination lock, whether it's a kind of a double-sided key, whatever it is. And strangely, I have looked into this, but the general principles aren't necessarily going to be the way that you unlock each of those individual locks. There's going to have to be a little bit of literal wiggle and play to try and figure out, okay, well, exactly how do I need to do this? You've got the overarching principles, but it's about playing around and experimenting within those general principles where you're going to be able to unlock that lock. Take that back to the player. We've got these general principles that are going to be, useful, that provide the parameters, but as a coach and someone that's really, really good at this, how do you play within the margins? How do you kind of execute that wiggle room and really try and unpack that person or unpick that lock that is that person and figure out how to spring that? That's something that takes experience, something that takes education, something that takes a hell of a lot of patience, particularly when you've got 18 to 21-year-olds.
It's almost as if you read this next quote, and it says, I picked up a saying from the legendary UCLA coach John Wooden. I don't treat them all the same, but I treat them all fairly. I asked all our players to achieve the same standard, but I couldn't ask them to do it all in the same way. Some took longer than others, and I think, how long do I have to wait before she gets it? Each young woman was unique, and their development happens at different speeds. So you're right on point there. It's understanding that and digging deep and understanding how it may look different, how you have to unpick that lock a little bit. I don't know if you have anything else to add on to that.
To be honest, I've exhausted my lockpicking knowledge.
Well, I can't add to any lockpicking knowledge. Now, she's won 3 championships now, and she really is mastering that art of coaching. And she uses the term being an emotional manipulator. And I don't love the term manipulator, but I think it will resonate with our listeners here. She says, all coaches are emotional manipulators at heart. And I was one of the very best of them. I'd become an excellent actress. I learned how to use all shades of my voice and my eyes to get the reactions we needed from the players. I could be warm or withholding, depending on what served the team. And usually what looked like my temper was on my part was all calculated. Coach Summitt says emotional manipulator. I say exceptional emotional intelligence. That idea that she can, emotional intelligence is about understanding your own emotions, but then understanding the emotions in those around you.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that that's not by accident. I think that's a testament to trying to learn about people and learn about what makes people tick and trying to get an understanding of them as a human, them as a performer, them wholly and in their entirety.
And Mickey DeMoss, her longtime assistant coach, kind of said this, and there's probably a nice little bit of a summary here of her EQ, and she says Pat was so in tune with the players, with when she knew when to push, when to let up, she knew when to put an arm around someone. She would seem so competitive, so high strung and demanding, and that the whole time she knew exactly what she was doing. She was very much in control. She had this innate clock or measuring stick and knew exactly how far to go with them. So that idea that she was in control, and you talked about that idea of that football coach completely out of control. Pat was in control, even if for her players, that anger, she'd lost control. The coaches, those that knew her best, like she could manipulate. She had that emotional intelligence. She knew how to push, when to pull, arm around the shoulder, kick up the butt. She had that skill.
That's a term that we hear in sports, particularly in professional sports, about someone being a great man manager, right? Where it's not about the X's and O's. It's not about your systems or your tactics or your strategies or your principles of play. It's about, can I get the best out of this person?
Now, this next paragraph really stood out for me, and I'd love your reflection on it. Coach Summitt says, sometimes I had to hurt a young woman to her core. Why? Because often players don't even know they are withholding something until they are pierced. When you pierce them, that's when that last of the individual ego finally pours out. It was a really powerful image for me. This idea that she would hurt people to the core and would pierce them to allow that ego to flow out. Go for it.
Thanks. Nice, easy one to walk into here. I mean, you said yourself earlier that you weren't Sigmund Freud, and I'll also make that claim as well. It almost feels like that's what 10 years of therapy is, when you'd sit down and peel away all of these layers and process that information, and at the end of the day you can finally get to this point where there's some sort of almost transcendental moment where there's this thing that's revealed, this revealed truth, as it were. And it sounds like this is a very surgical way just to cut right to the heart of it. Now, what I will say is, obviously the word hurt is quite evocative, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is hurt with the greatest of intentions. And I think that the really important thing here is that this process for me is hugely contingent on the relationship between the hurter and the hurtee, as it were, right? The coach and the athlete in this situation. That's so important. It's not just, I'm going to help this person self-actualize by just bang, going right to the heart of them. It's really having a strong sense of who they are, a strong sense of who they are in relation to you, and being able to carefully manage that process, because this could be a dangerous game.
And I think Coach Summit acknowledges in the book that she did make mistakes, and she didn't reach every athlete, and some people didn't feel that caring part and only got the piercing part. And she acknowledges that. And we talked about that high performance environment is not for everyone. And the environment Coach Summit, in particular, University of Tennessee created, wasn't for everybody. I don't think you have to do that to have a high performance environment. So I want to correct myself there, but I think she acknowledges that. I think there's another evocative part here that I'd love your reflection on. She said, I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was being honest. The standard conventional coaching manual says you don't embarrass players in front of teammates. But I disagree. Here's why. Dishonest teams don't win the big one. They corrupt their losses with rationalizations and excuses. They soothe their eggshell egos, and they keep making the same mistakes. But the truly ambitious teams find relief in honesty when they've lost, because it's a diagnostic tool that leads to a solution. Here's what we did wrong, and let's fix it. We don't ever have to feel this way again. Great teams explain their failures. They don't excuse it. When you explain a loss aloud, it's no longer a tormenting mystery. I believed in that brand of honesty my whole career, and I knew at least one other coach who believed in it too. What about that idea of embarrassing somebody in front of a group? That's a tough one. That's a tough one for me to kind of reconcile.
For sure. My favorite question in anything is, what's the point? Right? If we're gonna go down a road, what's the point? What are we actually trying to achieve? What's the outcome here? And I would say that probably 9 times out of 10, embarrassing someone probably not going to achieve the outcome you may think it's going to achieve. It's usually the wrong course of action. If there is a specific point to it, and really when you were reading through that paragraph, what jumped out to me is we're trying to shine a light on the things that aren't going well and trying to make some adjustments in order to correct. So I think embarrassment, for me, that's very identifying the problem and pointing fingers, and it's very judgmental in that sense. When I think about really what's going on in this paragraph and the way that you described it, is that's a process of reflection with the goal to find a solution. And I think that, I know you've met these people, and I've met these people too. They've got a problem for every solution. If you can go in with a solution for every problem, that's almost like a superpower. You'll be welcome in any organization, any group, any team, any high performing environment if you have a solution for every problem. So I think it's very important to recognize that you are dealing with people, and people at their essence have a strong sense of self-identity. And when that gets questioned or attacked, and I think that that's what embarrassment does, is it attacks people, particularly at their core, that's very, very, very rarely going to have a positive effect. Now, you can argue here, this is Pat Summitt, she made it work, and she mentioned one other coach, which I know we're going to dive into here. And the picture that I like to, when it comes to bad coaching practices or bad practices, if you put 6 eggs in a brown paper bag and throw the brown paper bag against the wall, and you pull out the one egg that didn't break and go, ta-da, the system works. It didn't work. You've smashed the other 5 eggs. That's no proof of anything. And I feel like this could be one of those instances where you've got a bag full of smashed eggs and one that you've chosen to highlight.
Well, you mentioned another coach, and I don't think you can tell the Pat Summitt story without talking about Gino Auriemma, the legendary UConn coach. And I think every great career, you need rivalries. We heard it with Agassi. Agassi needed Sampras to really, illuminate his deficiencies. And I think every great player has that rivalry or a team rivalry. And Tennessee definitely had it with UConn, and Pat had it with Gino. But she said, but we also had more characteristics in common than people would suppose, and we liked each other. We both loved to laugh. We both enjoyed expensive bottles of red wine. We both lived the game as if it was in us on a cellular level. We both taught it with an unrelenting energy and attention to detail. We both loved our players with loyal, familial devotion that gave us and them equal amounts of pleasure and agony. And we were both kinder people than we appeared to outsiders. She has a lot of good things to say about Gino. There's some in the book. There's also a little bit of criticism in there, and you hear from Gino kind of. I think they were very similar in a lot of ways. And he says college kids were still kids, and they were looking for direction. What gives you the stomach to do it is that you know you're right, and you're only saying what they already know and believe. And I think Gino was cut from a similar cloth to Pat Summitt in terms of that intensity and how he went about it and how he built, really a dynasty at UConn. Anything with regards to that idea of a great rivalry?
I think it's important, because if that level of rivalry isn't there, particularly at the top, it's very easy to get complacent. I think you mentioned that the hard bit isn't getting to the top of the mountain. It's about staying there, right? And if you're constantly fighting for national titles and you've got a coach on an opposing team that's as good in terms of recruiting and talent development and systems and all those sort of things, that forces you to evolve. That forces you to look at your thinking and reflect, and how do I, even eke out that 1% more, that last drop of juice that we can get out of it in order to get the best out of my athletes. I think it can actually be really, really empowering. I think the important thing to think about is that it's not about you and the other coach. That's a very easy road for you to go down here. It's not about that. It's about what's the bigger implication. How do I get the best out of my team? For Batman, it's not about defeating the Joker. It's how do I keep the citizens of Gotham City safe?
Oh, what a segue. Ultimately, to kind of put a bow on it, rivalries serve as a forcing function for us to reflect and improve. Through a rivalry, we are forced to get better. And UConn was forcing this self-awareness and forcing coach development. So after losing to UConn twice in 1995, I knew it wasn't just our players who had to get better. The coaches had to get better too. I wanted to get a grip on the UConn offense called the triple post. They beaten us twice with it, and I was determined to study it, whether we ever used it or not. If you understand how to run something, then you'll understand how to defend it. It's what you learn when you already know everything that counts, I like to say. Our ability to keep learning and teaching new things is what separated us and made us the best program in history. You're never too good to get better, Greg.
Absolutely nothing to add. That paragraph says it all.
And here we kind of hear about her system and her principles, and she says, although we had a system with principles and core values, we didn't deviate from them strategically. We just adjusted dramatically over the years as the game changed. The men's assistant coach at Tennessee at the time, Dean Lockwood, and Dean says, it impressed me how much of a student she was. What a learner. Here she is, someone in such command of her world, her team, her program. And I'm a 26-year-old. And yet she's looking at my stuff saying, what can I glean from this? What can I get out of this guy that can help us? I would see her in Stokely Center, standing at one end of the arena, leaning against the wall, watching us for 20, 30, 40 minutes. So we're hearing here from another coach that at this time, Coach Summitt, I think, has won 3 national championships. This rivalry with UConn is forcing her to get better. I think forcing is maybe a strong word. She is going to get better. She has that mindset that she is not happy just, continuing coaching the same way she's always coached. She wants to evolve. She's got her principles, but we're going to adjust how we execute those principles.
I think it's about evolution over revolution. It's about that tweaking, testing, iterating, figuring out what works, what doesn't work, what can we get rid of, what can we update, bringing in almost that kind of updating the phone software, right? Very rarely do you look at it and go, man, this is dramatically different. It's usually just like, oh, well, what did I even update there? It kind of looks the same. But, subtly something in there is different. Something in there is slightly improved. I think really what we've got here is this willingness to learn from everyone and this curiosity as a coach, right? And I think what we're starting to see more and more in the world of quote unquote high performance coaching is people going from the sporting environment and going into corporate environments and going in and learning from consultants in other industries and other trades and sharing of information. And really what that is that curiosity of how can I take a concept from here? I don't care who's got that idea. I just want to know if this is a good idea that I can then take and implement with my people. And I think that just, again, goes to that constant desire to be the best, that curiosity that's there, and that desire to continue pushing those people around you, but always, always feeding them, hopefully, the latest and greatest in information.
But from 1995, that demand or that idea of, hey, we're going to get better as a coaching staff resulted from 1996 to 1999, 3 national championships, the three-peat of the national championships. And there's a little bit of a case study here. She has a player, and I'm going to butcher the second name, but Michelle Marciniak, I believe that her last name is pronounced, but I could be wrong, so you can correct me.
Michelle, if you are listening, you feel free to write in, leave a review, and let us know if we got your name correct.
Absolutely. So this is a little bit of a case study with regards to coaching one of her leaders, a point guard. She said, Mickey and Holly winced at the way I dealt with Michelle. It was their job to soften the blows and to tell me when I'd gone too far. Now, Pat, they'd say, and I'd cut them off. If I didn't think she could take it, I wouldn't say it, I replied. I knew full well what Michelle wanted more than anything in the world was a compliment from me, but she wasn't getting it until she held the trophy. So late in Michelle's senior season, after a bad loss at Ole Miss, if I'd learned anything in all my years of teaching, it was that when you reach an impasse with a player, you get what you demand, not what you ask for. Sometimes you have to make yourself the adversary. I pushed Michelle to the brink unapologetically, and I did this out of the conviction in the oldest athletic training principle in the world. When you get right to the verge, the mind and the body respond by expanding. They grow. Can you coach college players the same way these days, Greg?
It depends. It really does. It does depend. I think this is a massive roll of the dice here, and this is something that could completely backfire. And obviously, we'll hear how this plays out. But when we talk about college players today, what does that mean? People are still people, and kind of interpret what you're trying to do and make sense of it differently. So again, it's about making sort of an informed decision here, right? Not knowing exactly how this is going to turn out, knowing that, okay, if I follow X, Y, and Z, this route here, then I might get this outcome. And I feel like this is a probability of getting a positive outcome here is what might happen, as opposed to the negative outcome. But again, it's about having all of that information and making an informed decision here. It's not just about gambling and pushing all of the chips in the middle and just kind of going for it. It's about really, really playing the odds.
The book goes into the complex relationship Coach Summitt had with Michelle. And then the final four versus Yukon, right before tip-off, I finally gave Michelle the compliment she craved. You've worked hard, I told the team, and you're prepared. I looked at Michelle, and you've got a great point guard and a great leader in Michelle. Key moment, she's been waiting for that compliment. And just hold right there, hold that thought. And this is a quote from Michelle. This woman who just beats on you all the time suddenly gives you a compliment that you're not ready for or prepared for at the most critical time. It worked. Hook, line, and sinker. I was in a different place in that game. Michelle, of course, goes for 21 points. Tennessee win 88-83. Momentum's continued on. They play Georgia in the final. They beat Georgia, killed Georgia 83-65 in 1996 to win their fourth national championship. Just how do you just dial it in when the absolute moment is needed, Greg?
Knowing exactly what it is your athlete needs from you in that moment. And this is kind of the culmination. This is almost a long game of that, what she calls that manipulation, right? And yeah, manipulation has a negative connotation language wise, but really what is it? It's trying to get that means to that end here. And played the odds, and it turned out in her favor.
So after the fourth national championship, waiting for me with outstretched arms was my father. I moved into them and he hugged me. I was 43 years old and it was the first one I'd ever gotten from him. I felt a rumbling in his chest and then he spoke. Someone around here knows how to coach, he said. My father stood in the doorway and abruptly and awkwardly, he said the words I'd been waiting for 43 years to hear. I love you, he said. I was stunned. I looked at him as if to say, Richard? Richard Head? He continued irritably. I don't ever want to hear from you again that I don't say I love you, or that I never hug you, or that I never tell you that I'm proud of you. Then he hugged me again. So she finally gets this kind of confirmation from her dad. Pretty crazy to think, though, 43 years. She hasn't had a hug. She hasn't been told that she's loved by her own dad, but she knew it. She knew it all along.
Yeah, you'd like to you'd like to know for sure, right? I'm sure that there's just that sort of inkling in the back of the mind that maybe isn't particularly psychologically healthy. I'd state my claim that it probably isn't. But I thought what was interesting here is very similar to the way that she handled Michelle, right? It was that I'm going to question you, make you continue to question yourself, and kind of at that 11th hour come in here and give you that compliment that you so sort of richly deserved, and then it sparks that phenomenal game in the final. So I thought it was really interesting to kind of see that parallel there, whether that's something that I'm drawing from that paragraph.
Now, the 1996, 97, 98, and there's actually a three-peat kind of obviously rolls into the 99 season there. They talk about every team is very different. Although it seems like a three-peat and a dynasty in that period, each team is very distinct and very different. And you talked about this idea of Theseus's ship in a previous podcast related to the All Blacks and Dan Carter.
Yeah, Theseus' ship, that idea of, if we change every plank of wood one by one on a ship, is it still the same ship? And actually, one listener pointed out that I could have also used Trigger from Only Fools and Horses, who had the same broom for 25 years. He had the handle and the head changed a couple of times, but it was the same broom. So shout out for pointing that out. I'm sure we can link a clip to that classic in the show notes. I'm sure we can spread that love and that joy there.
That'll be for our British listeners who will understand that reference.
Yeah.
Nobody else will understand that.
Might be a lost reference on those that aren't familiar.
So as she's trying to evolve, she's always trying to get better. The 1997 season, she turned to something called a predictive index to try and understand her teams. And it was a continual challenge to try and read kids. To peer into their hearts or into their heads and hoping to gain a little insight, I turned to something called a predictive index, a personality assessment test that business managers use to put people in the right job. It was an improvement over just going to a player's guidance counselor, which was what I'd done in the old days. And the PI gave me an outline of the player's emotional strengths and insecurities and what might motivate her. But the PI was useless with Abby Conklin. She took it 3 times and 3 completely different results. The first time she took it, she didn't even believe the profile was really hers. She has to take it again and then again. Each time she would decide who she wanted to be and then make different choices. That was Abby. So, Greg, thoughts on psych assessments? Don't be too negative.
Yeah, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with psychological inventories and those things, in the sense that I love to hate them. And I think that I do think that they certainly have their place and can be very, very useful tools. I think the cautionary part here is making any decisions based purely on something like a psychological assessment or an inventory here, or placing someone or looking at a tool like this that pigeonholes someone into a certain category. Those are some of the issues that I have with these things. Some of the things that I really like about these is it's another tool to have an understanding of what's going on with an athlete, or to get a little bit of not necessarily an athlete, but a performer, and get a little bit of a glimpse. I always find that these are great things to start, to kind of open up conversation, to perhaps learn more about that person that you're going to glean from a psychological assessment or psychological inventory anywhere. So I do feel like they have their place. There is a lot of skill in terms of administering them and understanding them and that sort of thing. But I think they can just crack the door open a little bit for you as a coach or a leader to be able to have a larger conversation and kind of build productive work from there. So I do love to hate them, but I'm trying to challenge my own thinking. I'm trying to grow here. Is that all right?
Yeah, you're relatively positive there, to be honest. Well, Abby, as we mentioned, so by 1997, this is another kind of case study similar to Michelle. Abby was a senior. And Pat says, there was a fine line between being demanding and being negative. And after the Stanford loss, I crossed it. I started off by saying, let's face it, we're handcuffed by Abby, who won't defend or rebound. Then I pointed at her. What was the one thing I asked you to do? I asked Abby. She had given up the middle of the floor and they had torn us apart in the middle. And Abby retorted, I don't agree, and started to haggle with me about what we should have done against Stanford. I stared at her. A senior was questioning my judgment in front of the entire team, a team that was losing, a team that was young, injured, and uncertain, and one that I was struggling to hold together, and which Abby had just done her best to pull apart by the seams. Most days in practice, Abby was low on my feedback. Suddenly, on this day of all days, she decided to give me some by defying me in front of her teammates. I said tightly, you're more stubborn than you are smart, and you're going to kill this team with it. For once, my anger wasn't an act. I felt betrayed by a senior I should have been able to depend on, and I had a hard time getting over it. Over the next few days, I became the one who's more stubborn than smart. So I think even the best are not the best all of the time, and coaches are human, and they make mistakes, and they can get triggered.
We are often very quick to give grace to other people. I think sometimes we need to be a little gracious to ourselves as well, and recognize that you're not always going to have your best day. And yes, there are implications of that, but recognizing that and hopefully making corrections on that as you go forward, that's a really important skill to have and learn and develop. Again, I think that goes back to your emotional intelligence and being able to develop and sharpen that blade, as it were, to be able to make sense of what's going on in the situation and recognize it's not always going to be easy. It's not always going to be fun, but hopefully the fun and the easy moments outweigh the tough ones.
So the team is struggling, and Pat's struggling with Abby, and seeks advice and gets advice from Mickey, the assistant coach, and Mickey tells her, look, you got to sit down with Abby to figure this out. And really, it's as part of turning this whole season around, Pat decides to meet with every player individually, including Abby. And then they meet as an entire team to have what they say in the book is like a therapy session that lasted 5 hours. And it's before a game with Old Dominion. And for me, what kind of resonated with me was that idea of a court session that we heard with the All Blacks and Dan Carter, this idea of everybody getting things off the chest. And the question that they asked, which is one I really liked, is why did you come to Tennessee? And Pat had every player talk about and reflect on that idea. Why did you come to Tennessee? And for me, it's that idea of kind of understanding purpose. Is there anything that you pick out of that idea?
I think briefly, yeah, that idea of alignment being so critical, making sure that we're not working oppositional to kind of the goals of everyone. And actually, Dan Carter talked about that in his experience with Steve Hansen. Right, he wasn't quite sure what Steve Hansen, his coach, had in mind, or what he had in mind for that sort of tail end of his career. But sitting down and having that conversation, they actually realized they were on the same page, and that helped them march on together and continue to be successful. I think what this does is, in this situation, either allows them to realize the same thing, or if they're not, how do we then correct those things and make sure that we are now aligned in order to move forward?
Obviously, we'd expect, well, the team will go out and win, but they don't. They lose to Old Dominion, but it is the turning point in this season. And she said, I'd never seen a team so pained by a loss. And while I felt awful, I was also relieved. It was the emotional buy-in I'd been waiting for. Listen up, I said. Get your heads up. If we get effort like that all the time, if you fight like this, I'm telling you, I promise you, we'll be there in March. And I enjoyed watching this team tonight. And it's a great compliment there from Pat. Like, the team loses, but it's that emotional turning point for the team. And I think it's just great coaching, isn't it?
I think it really is, because it goes back to those initial principles: effort and execution. And those were the things that we identified at the beginning as being the most important things, essentially in a sort of Pat Summitt system, as it were, a Pat Summitt team. Winning is a product of executing those things. So if you get your execution and your effort correct, this is what good coaching looks like. Because you quite easily go, oh, well, I told you we were going to get beat, right? But that's not what the important thing is here. Effort and execution under your control. You went out and did it. Okay, didn't go your way, but that's what we could control. That's what we did control. And if we continue to do that in the way that we did it, we can continue to grow and develop.
So we're going to jump ahead again, and the team is struggling in 97, even though it's part of this three-peat we talked about, so we know where the ending goes. But the team falls out of the top 10 for the first time in a decade, and they meet again as a team before the NCAA tournament. And now that they've made the tournament, the record doesn't matter. And Pat impresses them. The record doesn't matter once you make the tournament. But they know they have to go through the undefeated 33-0 UConn team in the Final Four. Now, they'd played them early in the season and lost 72-57. But remember, Pat and the coaching staff had learned from that, and they executed a flawless game plan, and they shocked UConn 91-81. It was one of the biggest upsets, actually, at the time. And of course, who do they meet again? They meet Old Dominion, the team that they had, previously lost to, and it's that kind of turning the season around. They meet them in the final. And no team had ever won the national championship after 10 losses. And this was, on paper, Tennessee's worst season. And they turn it into one of the best, and they win the national title 68-59. So they win the second national championship, part of the three-peat. And again, it looks like a solid block of triumph, but each one is distinctive. Pat says, the almost effortless, record-breaking 39-0 undefeated season in 98 was our finest ever. I knew right away it would be a different kind of year when even our practices had an extra intensity. We had 4 players, freshmen, who had burst onto the floor like atomic elements. Tamika Catchins of Duncanville, Texas, Samika Randall of Cleveland, Ohio, Kirsten Ace Clement from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Teresa Gita from Columbia, South Carolina were called the greatest recruiting class in history, and they lived up to it. They were so powerful and so hot-burning that I worried they would flame out. It wasn't my job to push them. I quickly discovered it was my job to slow them down, tell them when to stop. That fall, one of our veteran players, Misty Green, called Abby Coughlin to deliver an incredulous report. Bud, you won't believe it, she said. She asked if we felt like practicing today. She was worried that we were tired. So for almost the first time in Coach Summitt's whole career, she's holding a team back, protecting them from themselves. Now, it's an interesting concept and probably one that not a lot of coaches will ever experience, that you've got such a talented team, such a driven team, that you're the one holding them back. Talk about the psychology of that.
Yeah, I think the thing that jumps out here is quote of you bleed in training so you don't bleed in battle, right? That effortless undefeated season. Of course it wasn't effortless. That's ludicrous to think 39-0 would be effortless. But all of the hard work put on in the practice floor allows you to go out there and do that on sort of game day, on game night. I think it is really important to recognize that the role of a coach isn't set in stone. It isn't set, it isn't cast in concrete where you're always going to be the one that has to push people forward. Sometimes, as you mentioned there, it's about holding them back, a little bit of preservation for them and reining them in a little bit. That is a skill as well. And you may have players or performers in your group or your team. You might have a mix. You might have some people that need that push forward. You might have those people that need to be tied to a chair to stop them doing things, right? But again, it's about knowing your people and knowing what your role is as a coach, just in the same way that your point guard needs to know what their role is as a point guard. Understanding the system and what you bring to it, hugely important. And being able to execute that, knowing that it's what's right for the group, that's very, very important.
Great lead-in. But they were also young and needy, and as a group, they would require more mothering and less pure coaching than any team I'd ever had. We discovered that 9 out of our 12 players, including all 4 freshmen, had been raised for much of their lives by a single mother or their grandmothers, many of whom had worked multiple jobs to send their kids to college. To this day, I believe that team was driven in part by a needful urgency to repay their maternal debts. That's really, for me, just learning about your players, learning about the background, what do they need. And for her, she's now this really established coach. She's got such a comfort in her own expertise and authority. And she says, after 5 championships, I felt comfortable with who I was with our players. I no longer had anything to prove or authority to establish. We beat teams by an average of 30 points a night. I kept an eye on our players for fatigue. I was constantly worried that they might burn out. I coddled them. I had them over for dinner and cooked every single item they requested. She treated this team of 98 in 98 and this team of superstars very differently. And it almost seems so un-Pat Summitt like. She coddled them. She spoiled them.
She treated them the way they needed to be treated. That's it. And I know that sounds like a flippant comment, but that's it. It's about knowing your team, knowing what they need, and providing it, whether that is drilling X's and O's and philosophy and game principles, and this is what you're going to do, and developing independent thinkers, or whether that is coddling them, whether that's spoiling them, whether that's saving them from themselves in terms of fatigue. You can only play you play the course you're on, right? What does the group need from me right now? Can I provide that? That's what a coach is. It's about that servant leadership.
And I think you hear that, and she says, by the time of the NCAA tournament, we were the overwhelming favorites, flatly the most deserving team in America, and I'd never desired a title so badly for a group. But we were so young, I didn't know how they'd react to pressure. I was willing to go to any length to prepare them, use any manipulation to get their minds right. So Coach Summitt talks about the Elite 8 game being the toughest game to win in college basketball because of what it means to get to the Final Four. And in the Elite 8 game, they play North Carolina. And with 7 minutes left, they trail by 12. And she's going to talk about this concept of pressure. The thing you need to know about pressure is that it may be invisible, but it has physical properties. It constricts the blood flow to your smaller muscles, costing fine motor control, narrows your vision, and slows your reactions. It's real. It's the invisible vice of that gripped our kids against North Carolina. Suddenly, their feet and hands won't work. And for the first time all season, they actually got outrun down the court. So talk to me a little bit about pressure, Greg, and how that kind of manifests in those key moments.
Pressure is something that at some point in their life, everyone is going to face. And I think it is important to be able to start to think about how do you develop tools in order to manage pressure in those moments, because it's easy to do things when there's no pressure. So my first tip is to try and kind of change your relationship with pressure. Kind of do the mental gymnastics to realize that it's actually a sign that you're doing something that you love and something that's important to you. Think about this. If you never did something that was important to you ever again in your entire life, would that be a great experience? Probably not. So doing things that you love, doing things that's important to you, that's where pressure comes in. So recognizing that you're actually in a good spot. Secondly, when you experience pressure, it usually makes things speed up, or at least the perception of things speed up. So you might see like a music video where someone's usually sort of stood in the middle of Times Square and everyone else is sort of racing around them. That's sometimes what pressure can feel like. You're stuck in the middle and everything's so hectic. So try and experiment and figure out what you could use as what I like to call a circuit breaker, right? Now, a really good place to start here, as simple as it sounds, is to take a deep breath. Maybe even momentarily step away from the thing that you're doing and then return to it. Another thing is going deliberately slow, right? So when everything starts to speed up, the temptation is to continue to go with it, right? Really amp in and lean into that speed. Sometimes it's about going slower, which actually is going to be closer to the normal speed than you think it is. And then obviously we talked here about the fact that it has this physical manifestation. One of the things that you can do is something like tensing up and then feeling that relaxation as you let that tension drain out of your body. So we start to see physical manifestation. If we're shooting a free throw, we might get in shoulders and hands and arms. Tense those and then feel the relaxation as your shoulders drop and your hands drop and your arms drop. Those are all really useful, practical things that you can do when you're experiencing pressure.
Well, like with any fairy tale, they went 13 from 13 from the line and then outscored North Carolina 27-9 in the final 7 minutes, winning the game. And that was really the big hurdle for this just amazingly talented team. In the Final Four, they beat Arkansas by nearly 30. And then in the final, they play Louisiana Tech. And Coach Summitt says, I've never been more confident of a team in my life. And that was the morning when she woke up, the day of the final, and they blow the team out 93-75. All these events led me to think carefully about how I defined success as we entered a new decade in 2000. When you win as much as we did, you start to think you should win one every year, and that's just wrong. The three-peat had tricked us into doing the one thing I promised I'd never do: measure success purely by championships. It was my 25th year as a coach, and if there's one thing I'd learned in that quarter century, it was that losing was far more common experience than winning. The coming years would be constantly remind me of that. 8 seasons would go by between the three-peat and our next national championships. So, how do you manage success and failure?
I think it's actually surprisingly simple, to be frank. I think it's, first of all, recognizing that you can't just be judged on winning, right? Because, like I said earlier, 95% of the time, or even 99% of the time, you're actually going to be losing because only one team can ultimately win a championship. But I think going back to the why and back to that beginning and continuing to play and compete with alignment to your values, and particularly the principles of effort and execution, those seem very much like the North Star here.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And jumping ahead, I'd be amiss if I didn't talk about the time we were there in 2007 and 2008. We probably had a lot to do with it, to be honest.
I think so too, yeah. Massive contributions.
Yeah. The other person that might have had a contribution was Candace Parker, who was really the best player of her generation and led the team to victories against Rutgers in 2007 and then against Stanford in 2008. And that was Coach Summitt's last national title. How to sum it up? My Tennessee legacy is not some flat, dry record on a piece of paper, but a beautiful tree with living branches. To this day, not all of them felt wonderful about their experience at Tennessee. But Mickey always says, if they all loved it, we were doing something wrong. It was supposed to be an elite, demanding environment, and it wasn't right for everyone. But it was right for the 161 players who wore the orange, and the real legacy wasn't the victories, but knowing they had made something stronger when they left. And that's where we're going to leave the book today. But Greg, as always, there are so many lessons you can take from Coach Summitt. It doesn't matter if you're a coach or not. There's just so many life lessons. So let's get into them. 10 life lessons from Coach Summitt.
Well, it's definitely going to be difficult to boil it down to just 10, but let's give it a try. Number 1, embrace challenges as opportunities for growth. So viewing challenges as opportunities rather than obstacles can lead to significant personal and professional development. So Pat Summitt's relentless pursuit of excellence, despite numerous personal and professional challenges, is testament to this mentality. Number 2, value hard work and determination. Persistent hard work and determination are key drivers of success. I learned that hard work never killed anyone. Number 3, the importance of team cohesion and leadership. Effective leadership and a cohesive team are crucial for achieving collective goals. Number 4, commitment to continuous learning and adaptation. Constant learning and adapting are essential for long-term success. Pat Summitt's ongoing efforts to learn new strategies and adapt and evolve her coaching style, I absolutely guarantee, was paramount to her success. Number 5, find a balance between discipline and compassion. So balancing strict discipline with compassion is key in leadership and personal growth. So Pat Summitt's strict coaching style, coupled with her genuine care for her players, really sets that platform for great things to happen. Number 6, never underestimate the power of resilience. Resilience in the face of adversity is a powerful trait. Make sure that you're creating the environment in which resilience can come to the forefront. Number 7, embrace honesty and transparency. Honesty and transparency foster trust and growth, and we know how important those are for success. Dishonest teams don't win the big one. Number 8, recognize the value of each individual. Acknowledging and nurturing individual strengths contributes to collective success. Remember, Pat Summitt said, I don't treat them all the same, but I treat them all fairly. Number 9, the significance of education and personal development. Prioritizing education and personal development is as important as professional achievements. Don't forget, Pat Summitt had a 100% graduation rate for her players. That's outstanding. Number 10, you have a legacy beyond achievements. The true legacy lies in the positive impact on people's lives beyond just achievements that might occur in the performance domain or even on the basketball court. Pat Summitt's pride in her players, the growth and the culture she built really shines throughout this entire text.
Now, Greg, even though we're biased and we're big Pat Summitt fans, there's also lessons of caution and things that we can avoid. So what are the 10 behaviors to avoid from the Pat Summitt story?
Absolutely. Let's jump right in. Number 1, avoid neglecting emotional intelligence. Now, neglecting emotional intelligence in leadership can lead to ineffective communication and dynamics within your team. Number 2, don't overlook the importance of adaptation. Failing to adapt to new situations or methods can hinder your progress and your team's success. Number 3, avoid a singular focus on winning. An overemphasis on winning can overshadow personal development and team growth. Pat Summitt's realization that success isn't just about championship, it's also about player development. Number 4, don't underestimate the power of compassion. A lack of compassion in leadership can lead to a disconnect with your team members. Rules without relationships result in rebellion. Number 5, avoid inflexibility in coaching or leadership. Being too rigid in coaching methods can limit your team's potential. The job of a coach wasn't about being a martinet. Number 6, don't neglect personal health and well-being. Neglecting personal health can have long-term consequences on performance and life. Number 7, avoid disregarding team input. Ignoring team members' input and feedback can diminish trust and motivation. Summitt learned to value her players' perspectives and input and adjusted her coaching accordingly. Number 8, don't let fear of failure inhibit growth. Fear of failure can prevent taking necessary risks for growth and success. Commitment is all about risk. The payoff is either heartbreak or exhilaration. Number 9, avoid misusing authority. A misuse of authority can create a toxic environment and hinder team morale. If I have a great strength as a coach, it was that I got the most out of people. And finally, number 10, don't underestimate the importance of work-life balance. Failing to balance professional and personal life can very quickly lead to burnout and satisfaction. Well, that's all from us. But for now, please pop over to whatever platform you choose to listen or indeed now watch us on, and you can give us a hopefully 5-star rating. Don't forget to follow the show to make sure you don't miss any episodes. And we would love for you to leave a comment or a review and share your favorite episode with a friend. Spread the wealth. This all helps us to spread the word and keep us doing what we're doing. Lastly, again, if you want to dive deeper into any of the books that we discuss, please support the authors and click the links in the show notes to get a hold of them. And again, this will help support this show. Thanks very much for joining myself and Duncan on Performers.